All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at an article that you sent over. It's called Episode 167, Scientific Racism in the White House.
Right.
.pdf.
Okay.
And it's written by Jaime Hoerricks, Ph.D.
Right.
Now, this piece is really interesting.
Yeah.
It's getting a lot of attention because it's arguing that we're not just talking about access to services for autistic people anymore. It's that their right to exist is actually under threat.
Yeah, it's a very provocative claim. Yeah, and I think what's striking is how Hoerricks connects this to these larger societal forces at play.
Right, like the DSM.
The DSM, exactly.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Yeah, for those unfamiliar.
Which they initially thought.
That's the handbook that clinicians use to diagnose mental health conditions.
Yeah, and Hoerricks thought that was going to be the main tool for limiting autism diagnoses. They actually say DSM-5-TR is the mechanism by which the APA rolls back the prevalence rates and protects insurance company profits.
Right, and the DSM has this whole history with this.
Right.
Every so often it gets updated, and every update, there's changes to the diagnostic criteria, and that leads to a cascade of effects on research funding and insurance coverage.
Oh, absolutely.
But what Hoerricks is suggesting is that it's deliberate manipulation of the system.
Yes.
For these more sinister ends.
Right, because they go on to say that it's not just about the DSM anymore. It's about preventing autistic people from being born at all.
Wow.
They write, the new reality is one where the government isn't just limiting services. It is actively working toward a world where autistic people never exist.
That brings up some pretty dark chapters of history, right?
It does.
When we talk about preventing an entire group of people from existing, we're in the realm of eugenics.
Eugenics, yeah.
A movement with a very horrifying past.
Yeah, and this isn't just some, abstract concept from the past.
That thing, right?
Because they actually call out RFK Jr.
Yeah, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
for promoting what they call a eugenics-driven agenda.
It's significant because he's in a position of power and influence.
He's got a platform.
And his views carry weight.
Yeah, exactly. He's been very vocal about his stance on vaccines.
And what he believes is their connection to autism.
Right, and Hoerricks doesn't mince words at all.
Yeah.
They say his obsession with vaccines and toxins isn't about securing better lives for autistic people.
Right.
It's about erasing us.
It's a very serious accusation.
Yeah.
And it brings up the question, what are the potential consequences when someone with that much influence promotes an ideology that seeks to eliminate a certain group of people?
And it makes you think about how our society views disability and neurodiversity.
Could you break down neurodiversity for our listeners a little bit?
Yeah. Okay, so neurodiversity is this idea that neurological differences,
like autism, ADHD, dyslexia.
Right, they're not defects that need to be cured.
Right, they're natural variations in the human brain.
Exactly.
It really challenges that traditional medical model that views these things as disorders.
Right, so when we're talking about preventing autism, we're basically saying that this entire spectrum of human experience is just undesirable and should be eliminated.
And that goes against the core principles of neurodiversity.
And then there's this term that Hoerricks uses, scientific racism.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think we need to unpack a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. So scientific racism, unfortunately, has a very long and ugly history.
I know. I remember learning about this.
The misuse of science to justify racial hierarchies and discrimination.
Like using skull shapes.
Yeah, exactly.
For determined intelligence.
Yeah. And oftentimes that was used to target marginalized groups.
Okay, so how does that relate to what we're talking about today?
Well, Hoerricks is arguing that a similar tactic is being used with autism by framing autism as a defect or a disease that needs to be eradicated.
So it's like creating this fear around autism.
Hoerricks writes, the rollout will be swift. Already, funding is shifting. The rhetoric is shifting. And the most terrifying part, the majority of the public won't see the problem.
Right.
Because the messaging will be wrapped in the same old language that have helping autistic children, reducing suffering, and giving families hope.
So how do we start to see through that?
Well, I think Hoerricks offers an interesting example of this subtle shift in language. by dissecting a seemingly harmless article from Psychology Today.
Okay.
It looks like it's offering helpful advice for parents.
Right.
But Hoerricks actually breaks down specific quotes to show how it subtly reinforces this idea that autism is something to be fixed.
Yeah, they highlight this quote. The earlier support is provided, the greater the potential for positive outcomes.
Right.
Which sounds reasonable enough, right?
It does, yeah.
We hear about early intervention all the time.
Yeah, early intervention can be beneficial.
But Hoerricks is saying it's more about pressuring parents into these costly therapies that might not even be needed.
And playing into the hands of what they call the autism industrial complex.
Oh, so what is that?
So Hoerricks uses that term to refer to the network of businesses and organizations that profit off of autism diagnoses and treatments.
But they're saying it's a system that can be helpful.
Right. It's not to say that there aren't good services out there.
Right.
But sometimes they're prioritizing profit over the genuine needs and preferences of autistic people.
So they're taking something that could be good.
Right.
And exploiting it.
Yeah, and saying, look, autism is a problem.
Right.
It needs to be solved.
Instead of accepting it as a different way of being.
Exactly. And then there's another quote from that Psychology Today article. Instead of trying to fix a child, try to focus on helping them to thrive as the unique individuals they are.
Okay, so that sounds good.
It does, right.
Like accepting neurodiversity.
Yeah. On the surface, it seems like they're saying, we embrace this idea of neurodiversity. But Hoerricks is saying that when you look at it in context with the rest of the article, it's saying, we're not going to provide the support.
Right.
So you're on your own.
Figure it out yourselves.
Figure out how to make your kid fit in.
Wow. So it really puts the burden.
Exactly. Instead of saying, hey, we're going to create a system of support.
Right.
They're putting the burden on the individuals.
Okay. And then that last quote that they pulled out.
Yeah.
With sensitivity and patience, introduce them to alternative activities and support them in the process of trying new and different things.
Right. Again, it seems innocent enough.
It does until you start to think.
But Hoerricks is arguing that it's another example of pushing these autistic children toward conformity.
Yeah.
Even if it's done with sensitivity and patience.
Like, what if the child doesn't want to do that?
Right.
What if they're happy how they are?
Exactly. And it brings us back to the core of Hoerricks' argument.
It's not about the services.
Right. It's not about diagnoses.
It's about, like you said at the beginning.
It's about the right of autistic people to exist.
As they are.
As they are.
Without having to conform.
Without being pressured.
To these neurotypical norms.
Exactly.
Do you think there's any room for nuance here, though?
I mean, it's a complex issue.
Yeah, because there are definitely some autistic people who benefit from some therapies or interventions.
Yeah.
But we also want to respect individual needs and preferences.
I think the key here is to listen to autistic people.
What are their needs?
What do they want?
What do they want?
Yeah, what kind of support, if any, do they find helpful?
So it's not about imposing our views.
Exactly. It's about centering their voices.
Right. And giving them the agency.
Giving them the agency.
To make their own choices.
Exactly.
About their own lives.
It's about shifting the paradigm. From fixing to understanding.
Right.
From trying to make people fit a mold.
Right.
To actually creating a society that values and celebrates their unique contributions.
But that doesn't seem to be where we're headed as a society.
You know, it can be kind of scary.
Yeah.
But Hoerricks seems to be suggesting that we're moving in the opposite direction.
Towards this idea of eliminating autism.
Yeah, and I think it's important.
Which is a terrifying thought.
To acknowledge that that fear is not unfounded.
Oh, absolutely.
We've used science to justify discrimination and exclusion in the past.
Right, like what we talked about earlier.
Exactly, and that seemingly benevolent language can mask harmful agendas.
Okay, so what can we do?
Well, I think the first step is awareness. We need to be informed about these issues.
Okay.
Understand the history of eugenics. Recognize the subtle ways that language can be used to promote exclusion.
Be aware.
Be aware, and then I think we need to start challenging these ideas.
Okay.
We need to speak out against rhetoric that dehumanizes autistic people.
Okay.
And advocate for policies that support neurodiversity.
That sounds great, but how do we actually do that?
Well, there are a lot of ways to get involved.
Like what?
We can support organizations that are fighting for disability rights.
Okay.
We can educate ourselves and others about neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And we can challenge ableist language and attitudes when we encounter them.
So it can be small things.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be this huge undertaking.
Yeah. Even small actions can make a difference.
It does feel like a lot of responsibility.
It is, but it's also an opportunity
Okay.
to create a world that's more just and equitable for everyone.
I like that.
And that starts with recognizing the humanity and inherent worth of all people,
Right.
regardless of their neurological differences.
That's a good point.
And I think that's a good place to transition to our final part.
Okay, so let's move on to the last part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've talked about the historical context and the language that's being used and the potential consequences of this movement to, like, eliminate autism. It's a lot.
Yeah.
But where do we even go from here? Like, what's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think if we go back to what Hoerricks is saying, the real question is, what kind of society do we want to live in?
Yep.
Do we want one that embraces diversity in all its forms?
Which includes neurodiversity.
Yeah, or one that wants to get rid of anything that it thinks is different or undesirable.
Right, and it's not just theoretical.
Exactly.
We see this happening all the time.
With prenatal testing and gene editing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, like, if society is successful in preventing autism,
Right.
what's next?
Yeah, where does it end?
What other human traits are going to be, like, targeted for elimination?
It's like a slippery slope.
It really is.
And it brings up all these ethical questions about what it even means to be human.
And what about the rights of people with disabilities?
Right.
I mean, Hoerricks is arguing that this is bigger than just access to services.
Yeah, it's about the right of autistic people to exist.
And to exist as they are.
Exactly.
Without having to conform or change.
And that's a right that everyone should have.
It should be a basic human right.
No matter their differences.
It's about recognizing, like, the inherent worth of each person.
Yeah, and I think it's also about recognizing that diversity is a strength.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine a world where everyone thought and acted and experienced the world in exactly the same way.
That would be so boring.
Right. It wouldn't just be boring.
Yeah.
It would be limiting.
It would stifle innovation and creativity.
We need those different perspectives.
Yeah, to push us forward as a society.
Exactly.
But it feels like we're going up against, like, some really powerful forces.
I understand.
Like people with big platforms who have these ideas.
It can be overwhelming.
Yeah, like, how do we make a difference when these people are promoting these views?
But we can't forget that we're not powerless.
Yeah.
Our voices matter.
Right.
Our actions matter.
Okay, so don't be complacent.
Right. We can educate ourselves and others. We can challenge ableist language.
Right.
And we can support organizations that are actually fighting for disability rights.
So you're saying, like, don't underestimate the power of each person to make a change.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
Listen to autistic people.
Okay.
Amplify their voices.
Right.
They're the experts on their own experiences.
I know what it's like.
Read what they write.
Yeah.
Support them.
Because this shouldn't just be a conversation happening among non-autistic people.
Exactly. Their voices need to be centered in all of this.
Okay, so make sure we're actually listening to autistic people.
Right. And remember that autism is not a monolith.
Oh, that's a good point.
There's no one single autistic experience.
It's a spectrum.
Exactly.
There's so much diversity within that label.
So we need to be willing to learn from autistic people and challenge our own assumptions and biases.
And be open to understanding their perspectives.
Yeah.
I think this deep dive has really challenged a lot of my own assumptions.
I'm glad.
It's been a real eye-opener.
It's been a learning experience for me, too.
And I think this article is like a wake-up call for all of us.
We can't be complacent.
Right. We can't sit back and let this happen.
Especially with so much at stake.
We need to actually engage in these tough conversations.
And fight for a world where everyone can thrive.
No matter their differences.
Exactly.
So to our listener, we'll leave you with this thought. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Are you going to just stand by and watch this happen? Or are you going to actually participate in shaping a more inclusive world for autistic people and for everybody?
We hope you'll join us in this fight.
We hope you'll take action.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.